Light fractured through 1,000 crystals in the grand ballroom's chandelier, scattering across the faces of Gotham's elite like fallen stars. The air, thick with the suffocating scent of hothouse flowers and ambition, hummed with the curated murmur of influence. To Alara Vance, it was a gilded cage. And tonight, she was the main exhibit. She stood on a small dais at the front of the room, a slim figure of disciplined grace in a black architectural gown, the coveted City Visionary Award a cool, heavy weight in her hands. Her design for the new North Riverfront Civic Center, a soaring structure of glass and steel that promised to redefine the city's skyline, had just been awarded the most prestigious contract in a generation. Her smile was a masterpiece of engineering, designed to convey gratitude and poise while betraying none of the bone-deep weariness she felt. For 10 years, since graduating at the top of her class, she had fought for this. She had outdesigned, outmaneuvered, and outworked every rival in a field dominated by men who saw her as a novelty. Tonight was supposed to be her coronation, the culmination of a life rebuilt from ash. The flashbulbs of the press corps popped and flared, a relentless barrage of light. The mayor, a man with a politician's practiced warmth, stood beside her, his hand hovering near her back. It was in this blinding moment of triumph that she saw him moving through the crowd. Councilman Julian Thorne. He navigated the room with the predatory ease of a shark in its home waters, impeccably dressed, his silvering hair catching the light. He projected an aura of old-money gravitas and unimpeachable public service. To the city, he was a pillar of tradition, a guardian of its heritage. To Alara, he was the ghost at the feast. His smile, when it finally turned on her as he ascended the dais, was a work of art, all warmth and patrician charm, a perfect mask for the cold malice she knew lay beneath. "Ilara, my dear," he said, his voice a smooth baritone that carried just enough for the nearest microphones to catch. He took her free hand, his touch lingering a fraction too long. A truly breathtaking achievement. On behalf of the City Council and my family, our sincerest congratulations. "Thank you, Councilman," Alara replied, her voice perfectly even. Her smile remained fixed, a shield of polished steel. She knew this was not a simple pleasantry. With Julian Thorne, it never was. He leaned in closer, ostensibly for the benefit of a photographer orchestrating a group shot with the mayor. The scent of his expensive cologne was faint, clean, and utterly chilling. His next words were a whisper, a silken thread of venom meant only for her, yet delivered in the full glare of the public eye. "It's truly remarkable how far some people can come," he murmured, his eyes glittering with a dark, triumphant light, with the right mentorship. The word landed not in her ears, but in her gut, a physical blow that stole the air from her lungs. Mentorship. It was their word, a secret, poisoned chalice from a past she had spent 2 decades trying to bury. It was a coded reference to the devastating childhood tragedy that had shattered her world, an event where her family was publicly eviscerated and his was lauded as their compassionate saviors. He was reminding her, in front of everyone who mattered, of her origins not as a brilliant architect, but as a charity case, the daughter of a disgraced man. He was telling her that her foundation was built on sand, on a history he owned and could weaponize at will. For a terrifying, fractional second, the grand ballroom dissolved around her. The popping flashbulbs became the flickering blue and red lights of police cars outside her childhood home. The clinking of champagne glasses became the sound of her mother's weeping. The suffocating scent of flowers became the smell of wet earth on a cold November morning. Her meticulously constructed composure threatened to crack. The award in her hand felt impossibly heavy. A fraud's trophy. She could feel the heat of a primal scream building in her chest. A scream of a terrified 8-year-old girl who had lost everything in a single, bewildering night. But she was not that girl anymore. She had spent 20 years forging armor from her pain. She inhaled. A slow, deliberate breath that settled the chaos within her. She met Julian Thorne's gaze, and the icy smile she offered in return was no longer just a professional courtesy. It was a declaration. It was the polished, unyielding surface of a diamond, forged under unimaginable pressure. It was the mask she had perfected to hide the deep, gaping wound he had just ripped open. And it was the face of the war he had just begun. The photographer, oblivious, called out, big smiles. Everyone. Alara's smile widened. A brilliant, chilling display. She would give them a smile. She would stand in the blinding light, a paragon of success and grace. But beneath the surface, a cold, quiet engine had just ignited. Julian Thorne had made a critical error. He thought he was reminding her of his power over her past. Instead, he had just given her a reason to reclaim her future, piece by bloody piece. The night was no longer a coronation. It was an armistice. And he had just fired the first shot. Alara's office was the antithesis of the gala's opulent chaos. It was a sanctuary of controlled thought, a space of polished concrete, sharp angles, and disciplined light that spilled through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the industrial chic of the city's reclaimed warehouse district. Every object on her wide, minimalist desk, the perfectly aligned pens, the single, pristine architectural model, the sleek black laptop was placed with surgical precision. The environment was a direct reflection of her mind, ordered, focused, and utterly devoid of clutter. It was here, in this sterile haven, that she could dismantle the world into its component parts and reassemble it according to her own design. Her firm, Vance Architecture, occupied the top 2 floors of a building she herself had redesigned. It was a testament to her philosophy, honoring the strong bones of the past, while unapologetically embracing the future. Her team was small, elite, and fiercely loyal. At the heart of it was Liam Chen, a junior architect whose youthful idealism was tempered by a near-photographic memory for municipal building codes. He saw Alara not just as a boss, but as a visionary, and his devotion was a quiet, steadying presence. The preliminary soil reports from the North Riverfront site came back, Liam said, entering her office without knocking, a habit she encouraged. He held a tablet, his brow furrowed in concentration. Geotechnical looks solid, better than expected. Actually, no unforeseen complications. Good, Alara said, her gaze fixed on the digital schematics of the Civic Center on her large monitor. That keeps us on schedule. Have the structural engineering team run the simulations with the new data. I want to be 3 steps ahead of any questions the Council's Oversight Committee might have. Already on it. Liam beamed, his relief palpable. Alara, this building, it's going to be a masterpiece. It's not a masterpiece until it's built. Liam, until then, it's just a liability. Her tone was brusque, but Liam understood it was her way of managing expectations, of never celebrating until the final brick was laid. What he couldn't see was the shadow that Thorne's whispered insult had cast over the project. Every line of the design now felt fraught with a deeper meaning. The building's central feature was a vast, open-air public forum, a space she'd conceived as a modern agora for the city's citizens. Now, it felt like a monument to a truth that had never been allowed a voice. Her other key ally was not an architect, but a historian of sorts. Marcus Thorne, no relation to Julian, a fact that was a source of constant, bitter irony for him was an old family friend, a man who had known her father, Robert Vance, long before his fall from grace. Marcus was a lifer in the city's Department of Records, a gentle, bookish man who presided over a subterranean kingdom of paper and microfilm. He was Alara's living link to a past she only understood in fragments. She met him that afternoon in a small, dusty coffee shop near City Hall, a neutral ground that smelled of aging paper and burnt espresso. Marcus, with his rumpled tweed jacket and glasses perched on the end of his nose, looked more like a university professor than a city clerk. "You look tired, Ellie," he said, his voice soft with concern. He had always been the one person who refused to be intimidated by the fortress she'd built around herself. "The gala ran late," she offered, a half-truth. "Marcus, I saw Julian Thorne." Marcus's expression tightened. He stirred his coffee. The clinking of the spoon against ceramic, the only sound between them for a long moment. He never misses a chance to be seen with the winner. Does he? He's a parasite that thrives on proximity to power. "He said something to me about my past." "Let me guess." Marcus sighed, his shoulders slumping. "He offered his family's continued support, reminded you how proud his father would be of the little orphan girl he so generously took under his wing." Alara flinched. Marcus's words were a perfect echo of the veiled condescension the Thorne family had shown her for years. After her father, a celebrated investigative journalist, had died in what was ruled a suicide following a massive financial scandal. It was Julian's father, the elder statesman, Alexander Thorne, who had publicly established a trust for her education. It was a masterstroke of public relations, casting the Thornes as benevolent saviors while cementing the narrative of Robert Vance as a failed, corrupt man. "He used the word mentorship," Alara said, the word tasting like ash, in front of the press. Marcus set his spoon down with a sharp clatter. "He's sending a message. He's telling you not to forget your place." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "There's been talk. Whispers in the halls. Thorne has been meeting with the Historical Preservation Society. He's been asking questions about the North Riverfront zoning, talking about the character of the neighborhood." Alara felt a cold dread seep into her bones. This was how it started, not with a direct assault, but with the slow, methodical poisoning of the well. Thorne wasn't just a ghost. He was an active threat. Her project, the symbol of her triumph, was to be built on a tract of land that had been a derelict industrial park for 50 years. There was no historical character to preserve. It was a fabricated concern, a bureaucratic weapon he was preparing to wield against her. "He wants to block the project," she stated, the realization solidifying into a cold, hard certainty. "He wants to remind you who holds the power in this city." "Ellie," Marcus corrected gently, "your father challenged that power, and they crushed him. Julian is his father's son. He can't stand to see a Vance succeed, especially on a project this visible. A Vance rebuilding a piece of the city his father helped ruin. The optics are unbearable for him." Alara looked out the window at the imposing, gray facade of City Hall. Its marble halls echoed with the ghosts of forgotten promises, a place where ambition and justice were often mutually exclusive. For years, she had believed that success would be her shield. If she built things that were beautiful and undeniable, if her name became synonymous with progress and innovation, the shadows of the past would finally recede. She had been naive. The past wasn't a shadow. It was a foundation, and hers was rotten with lies she had never been allowed to question. "He thinks I'm still that little girl he saw crying at her father's funeral," Alara murmured, more to herself than to Marcus, the one his family could pat on the head and mold with their charity. She finished her coffee, the bitter liquid doing nothing to wake her from the nightmare that was her own history. A new resolve began to settle over her. She had won the contract based on merit. She would not let a man's petty, inherited vendetta destroy it. "He's about to find out how much I've learned from his family's particular brand of mentorship," she said, her voice quiet but edged with the hardness of forged steel. She stood up. Her meeting with Marcus concluded. The fight was no longer just about a building. It was about the very ground on which it would stand. The declaration of war came not as a thunderclap, but as a quiet, official-looking email. It arrived on a Tuesday morning. Its subject line a masterpiece of bureaucratic malice. Notice of Community Impact Review for the North Riverfront Civic Center project. Alara read it twice, her fingers frozen on her keyboard. The email, sent from the office of the City Planning Commission, was CC'd to the entire City Council, the Mayor's office, and a dozen different civic committees. It stated that, following numerous inquiries from concerned community stakeholders, a special review board was being convened to assess the project's adherence to the city's historical and aesthetic continuity. The name at the bottom of the list of concerned stakeholders was Julian Thorne. "Liam, get in here," Alara said, her voice dangerously calm as she spoke into her office intercom. Liam appeared a moment later, holding a schematic. "Is this about the email? The whole office is buzzing. What does it mean?" "It means Councilman Thorne has just pulled the emergency brake," Alara said, leaning back in her chair and steepling her fingers. "This isn't a review. It's an ambush. He's creating a new layer of bureaucracy designed to bleed us to death with delays and revisions. He'll stack this review board with his own people preservationists, traditionalist architects, community activists he funds through back channels. They'll demand changes, redesigns, more studies. They'll stall until the financing expires, and the entire project collapses under its own weight." Liam's face paled. "But they can't do that. We have a signed contract. The design was approved by the council. Thorne himself voted for it." "That was the public vote. Liam, the one in front of the cameras," Alara explained, a weary cynicism lacing her words. "He had to vote yes. The public support was overwhelming. But he knew he could kill it later, quietly, in the halls of power where the real decisions are made. This is his weapon procedure. He's going to use the city's own rules to strangle its future." The phone on her desk rang. It was the mayor's chief of staff, a man whose voice was slick with practiced apology. He was terribly sorry about this unforeseen development, insisted the mayor was a staunch supporter of her project, but explained that the council had a right to ensure due diligence. It was a textbook political maneuver, an attempt to publicly support her while privately stepping out of Thorne's way. He was offering sympathy, not help. Alara hung up, a cold fury solidifying within her. She had played by the rules. She had won. And now, the man who had haunted her life was changing the game entirely. He wasn't just attacking her building. He was attacking the very principles of fairness and merit she had clung to. Her first move was to call an all-hands meeting. She stood before her small, anxious team in the firm's main conference room, a space dominated by a large, pristine model of the Civic Center. "As you all know, our project has been subjected to a new review process," she began, her voice steady and commanding. "This is a politically motivated attack, orchestrated by Councilman Julian Thorne. It is designed to demoralize us and destroy this project through attrition. We will not let that happen." She looked into the eyes of each of her employees, from the senior partners to the interns. "From this moment on, we are no longer just an architecture firm. We are a campaign. Liam, I want you and your team to pull every single public statement Thorne has ever made about urban development, progress, and civic investment. Cross-reference them with his voting record. I want to know every time he's contradicted himself. Sarah, she said, turning to her head of communications, I want you to prepare a press packet. Emphasize the project's economic benefits, the jobs, the investment, the revitalization. Frame this review as what it is, an attempt by one man to hold the city's progress hostage. Her team, sensing the shift from defense to offense, began to rally, the anxiety in the room replaced by a focused energy. That evening, Alara worked late, the city lights twinkling below her office window. She was compiling her own files, not on architecture, but on Julian Thorne. She was mapping his network of influence, his political appointments, his financial disclosures. It was a daunting task. Thorne had spent 30 years building an empire of favors and alliances. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Heard about the review. This is his classic move. He did the same thing to the light rail expansion project a decade ago. Stalled it for 2 years until the federal funding was pulled. Alara texted back. This time it's different. How so? Marcus replied. This time, he's not just fighting a project, he's fighting me. The words glowed on her screen, a stark promise in the quiet of her office. The inciting incident was not just an email, it was the drawing of a battle line. Thorne had made his move, expecting her to buckle, to become entangled in the red tape he had created. He assumed she would fight him on his terms. In the arena of city politics, where he was king, he had no idea she was about to open a new front, one that led directly into the shadowed history they shared. He thought he was killing a building, but he was awakening a ghost far more dangerous than his own. The first public assault came a week later, on the front page of the city's most influential newspaper, the Gotham Chronicle. The headline was a carefully crafted piece of character assassination, visionary, or vapid question swirl, around architect behind controversial civic center. The article, penned by a veteran journalist, known to be a close associate of Julian Thorne, was a masterclass in insinuation. It began by praising Alara's meteoric rise before pivoting sharply, questioning if her bold, some might say aggressive, modernism was a good fit for the city's cherished historical fabric. It quoted anonymous sources from within the architecture community who expressed concerns about her lack of collaborative spirit. But the real poison was in the final 2 paragraphs. While Vance's professional achievements are undeniable, the article read, sources close to the city council have raised concerns about the immense public pressure being placed on such a young architect, especially one with a famously tragic family history. Her father, the once respected journalist Robert Vance, was at the center of a devastating financial scandal 20 years ago that ended in his public disgrace and suicide. We all want to see her succeed. One City Hall insider is quoted as saying, but we have to wonder if she has the emotional fortitude to handle a project of this magnitude. The city is making a billion-dollar bet, and we need to be sure the person in charge is on solid ground. Alara read the words on her tablet, a cup of coffee growing cold in her hand. The attack was more vicious than she could have imagined. Thorne hadn't just used a proxy to attack her design. He had exhumed the ghost of her father and paraded it through the town square. He had taken her private trauma and reframed it as a professional liability. It was a brutal, low blow, designed to undermine her credibility and paint her as unstable, a victim of her own past. The fallout was immediate. Her phone began to ring incessantly, with calls from concerned investors, allies on the council, and reporters hungry for a comment. Her team arrived at the office that morning, walking on eggshells, their faces a mixture of fury and pity. Liam was incandescent with rage. This is disgusting. It's a hit piece. Alara. He's attacking your family. We should sue them for libel. And get caught in a legal battle that lasts for years. That's what he wants, Alara said, her voice a tight, controlled wire. She felt a familiar, cold detachment settling over her. The emotional armor she donned in a crisis. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. He's testing me. He wants to see if I'll break. If I get angry. If I get emotional. I prove his point. I confirm the narrative that I'm unstable. Instead of issuing a furious denial, she instructed her communications director to release a brief, elegant statement. My father was a complex man who made mistakes, but he also taught me the importance of fighting for the truth. My personal history is a source of my strength, not my weakness. I remain fully committed to delivering a world-class civic center for the people of this city. I will not be distracted by personal attacks. It was a calculated, dispassionate response that gave the story no more oxygen. But behind the scenes, Alara was preparing her counterattack. The article was Thorne's first major obstacle, and she knew she had to dismantle it, not just deflect it. That night, she met Marcus in the cavernous, silent reading room of the city archives, under the dim glow of a single desk lamp, surrounded by towering shelves of bound volumes. He laid out a series of old city planning documents. Thorne's public persona is that of a preservationist, Marcus whispered, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. He claims to be the guardian of the city's soul, but his record tells a different story. He pointed to a zoning variance application from 15 years prior. A major real estate developer, a close friend and major campaign donor to Thorne, had wanted to tear down a registered city landmark to build a luxury high-rise. The Historical Preservation Society had been in an uproar. Publicly, Thorne had made speeches about the importance of the building, but Marcus had found the minutes from the closed-door council committee meeting. Thorne had cast the deciding vote in favor of the variance, allowing the demolition to proceed. He talks about heritage, but he serves money, Marcus said, his finger tracing the record of the vote. He uses preservation as a shield for his own agenda, when it suits him. He's a historian, when a donor needs a favor. He's a pragmatist. Alara photographed the documents with her phone. It was a start, a crack in Thorne's carefully constructed facade. But it wasn't enough. Her real opportunity to fight back came 3 days later. The television station City News 1 invited her for a live, one-on-one interview to address the controversy surrounding her project. Her team advised her against it, fearing a televised ambush. Alara insisted she would not hide. She walked onto the brightly lit studio set, feeling a cold, crystalline calm. The interviewer, a sharp, seasoned journalist named Evelyn Reed, began with predictable questions about the review board and the delays. Alara answered them calmly, reiterating the project's benefits and her commitment to seeing it through. Then, Evelyn leaned forward, her expression serious. Councilman Thorne has not commented directly, but sources say he is the driving force behind this review. An article this week in the Chronicle raised questions about your family's past, suggesting you may lack the stability for a project this large. How do you respond to that? This was the moment, the trap Thorne had set. Alara looked directly into the camera, not with anger, but with a quiet, compelling sincerity. Evelyn, my father's story is a painful one, and it's a matter of public record. But since others have decided to make it relevant to a discussion about architecture, let's talk about it. My father taught me that a city's foundation isn't made of concrete and steel, but of integrity. He taught me to question the stories we are told, especially by those in power. She paused, letting the words land. I find it ironic that these concerns about stability are being raised now, when my project threatens to revitalize a part of the city that has been neglected for decades. And the concerns about historical character are equally fascinating. She looked back at Evelyn. 15 years ago, Councilman Thorne cast the deciding vote to allow the demolition of the old Criterion Theater, a registered city landmark, to make way for a luxury high-rise built by one of his largest campaign donors. He spoke then about the need for pragmatic progress. Today, he speaks of historical preservation to block a civic project on land that has been a derelict industrial park for 50 years. The public can draw their own conclusions about which is the real Julian Thorne. In the studio's control room, producers began scrambling. Alara had just turned an interview about her personal life into a direct, evidence-backed challenge to Thorne's integrity. Evelyn Reed, caught off guard but recognizing a major story, pressed on. Are you accusing the councilman of hypocrisy? I am stating a fact, supported by the city's own records. Alara replied smoothly. The people of this city deserve consistency from their leaders, not a set of principles that changes depending on who is funding their campaigns. My project is about building a transparent, open, and accessible future for this city. The design itself reflects that. Now, I hope we can return the conversation to architecture and not the political games being played to obstruct it. She had done it. She had weathered the first storm, not by defending herself, but by exposing her attacker. The interview was a sensation. By the next morning, the narrative had shifted. The headlines were no longer about her tragic past, but about Thorne's questionable vote on the Criterion Theater. The Chronicle was forced to print a defensive follow-up piece. Thorne, for the first time, was on the back foot. Alara knew this was only a temporary victory. She had survived the first obstacle, but she had also shown Thorne her teeth. She had proven she would not be an easy target. The war was far from over, but she had won the first battle, not with anger, but with cold, hard, and undeniable truth. The weeks that followed settled into a grinding war of attrition. Alara's televised counterpunch had momentarily silenced the public criticism, but Thorne's institutional assault intensified. The Community Impact Review Board was officially formed, and, as Alara had predicted, it was a gallery of Thorne's loyalists, a staunch traditionalist architect who had lost the Civic Center bid to Alara, the head of a historical society that received significant funding from Thorne's Family Foundation, and a NIMBYist community organizer with a history of opposing any new development. Their demands were as petty as they were obstructive. They requested a new environmental impact study. They raised concerns about the reflective glare of the building's glass facade and its potential effect on migratory birds. They insisted on a series of public hearings in neighborhoods on the opposite side of the city, ostensibly for citywide feedback, but designed to attract opposition and create negative press. Alara and her team were caught in a bureaucratic quagmire, spending their days responding to endless procedural requests instead of focusing on the actual work of architecture. The project's timeline was slipping, and the holding costs on the land and financing were mounting. We're drowning in paper, Liam said, exhausted, dropping a thick binder of regulatory filings on Alara's desk. We've submitted the same wind shear analysis 4 times. They keep losing it. This is insane. It's not insane, Liam. It's a strategy, Alara replied, her eyes scanning a spreadsheet of Thorne's known political associates. He's using the process as a weapon. We can't win by simply complying. We have to find a new front. She knew she needed leverage, something more potent than a 15-year-old hypocrisy. She had to prove that Thorne's opposition wasn't just a matter of principle or politics, but of personal gain. She tasked her allies with a new, more dangerous phase of their counteroffensive, a quiet investigation into Julian Thorne himself. It began with Marcus, in the dusty catacombs of the city archives. He began a methodical search, cross-referencing property deeds, tax assessments, and incorporation papers. He was looking for a pattern, a hidden financial thread that connected Thorne to the North River front. Julian is too smart to have his name on anything directly, Marcus told her over a secure messaging app. But his family is old money. Their wealth is a tangled web of trusts and holding companies. It will take time. Meanwhile, Liam, with his savant-like knowledge of city planning, started digging into Thorne's legislative record. He wasn't looking for major scandals, but for the small, almost unnoticeable amendments and riders Thorne had attached to city bills over the years. It was tedious, painstaking work, sifting through thousands of pages of legislative text. While her allies dug in the shadows, Alara fought in the light. She attended every public hearing, her composure unnerving the board members Thorne had appointed. When they questioned her design choices, she responded with calm, articulate defenses, armed with data and precedent. When they tried to bait her into an emotional response, she simply smiled and redirected the conversation back to the facts. She was slowly winning the battle of public opinion. Citizens who attended the hearings began to see the board's tactics for what they were, a transparent attempt to obstruct progress. Thorne, feeling the tide shifting, decided to escalate. His methods became more direct, more threatening. One evening, as Marcus was leaving the archives, two men in dark suits stopped him in the deserted parking garage. They didn't touch him. They didn't have to. "You've been spending a lot of late nights at the office, Mr. Thorne," the first man said, his voice flat and menacing. "The city clerk's office is very concerned about employee burnout and document security. It would be a shame if something important were to go missing. A greater shame if it were to be found in your possession." The threat was unmistakable. Marcus, a man who had spent his entire life around paper, was shaken to his core. He called Alara from a payphone, his voice trembling. "They know. Ellie. They know I'm looking." Alara's blood ran cold. Thorne was no longer just attacking her. He was targeting the people she cared about. "Go home. Marcus, lock your doors. Stop looking. It's too dangerous." "No," Marcus said, a surprising firmness in his voice. "Your father wouldn't have stopped. And I won't either. But we need to be smarter." The next day, Liam received a certified letter at his apartment. It was from a federal student loan servicer, announcing a random audit of his financial aid applications from his university years. It was a clear intimidation tactic, a shot across the bow designed to terrify a young man with a mountain of debt. Liam was pale with fear when he showed her the letter. "My parents co-signed those loans. Alara. Their house is the collateral. I can't." Alara looked at the fear in his eyes and felt a rage so profound it was almost clarifying. This was the true face of Julian Thorne's power. Not the eloquent speeches in the council chamber, but the back-alley threats and bureaucratic terrorism. She sat Liam down in her office. "This is not a random audit. This is a message from Thorne. He's trying to scare you. He's trying to isolate me." She opened a drawer in her desk and took out a business card. It belonged to the best financial lawyer in the city. "Give this man a call. Tell him you work for me. My firm will cover every cent of the cost. You are not alone in this. Liam." Thorne's escalation was a mistake. By threatening her allies, he hadn't isolated her. He had galvanized her. The fight was no longer just about a building or her reputation. It was about protecting the people who had stood by her. The lines had been drawn. and Thorne had just crossed one from which there was no return. The rising action was over. The time for subtle maneuvering had passed. It was time to find the secret that would bring his entire rotten edifice crashing down. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Liam, while combing through the zoning code amendments Thorne had sponsored, noticed a recurring pattern. Over the past 5 years, Thorne had championed a series of small, seemingly unrelated changes to the regulations governing land use in the city's post-industrial corridors, the very areas, like the North Riverfront, that were ripe for redevelopment. The changes were dense and technical, buried in hundreds of pages of legal jargon. But their cumulative effect was clear. They made it incrementally easier to acquire and rezone derelict land for commercial use, provided the developer met a specific set of arcane criteria. It's like he was building a secret doorway in the city code, Liam explained, pointing to lines of highlighted text on a screen in Alara's office. And only he has the key. At the same time, Marcus, now working with extreme caution, made a discovery of his own. He wasn't looking at Thorne's finances, but at his father's. He found an old, inactive shell corporation, Argus Holdings LLC, that Alexander Thorne had established decades ago. It had been dormant for years, a forgotten relic of old business dealings. But there was one transaction that stood out, one that made Marcus's blood run cold. It was dated November 12th, 20 years ago, the day after her father's death. On that day, Argus Holdings had executed its final and only significant transaction, the purchase of a small, residential property in the suburbs. The property was immediately flagged for demolition. The address was 412 Willow Creek Lane, Alara's childhood home. Marcus called her, his voice a strained whisper. "Ellie, why would Alexander Thorne's company buy your house? Only to tear it down." Alara stood in her office, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and white beyond the window. The two threads of information, Liam's discovery of the zoning doorway and Marcus's revelation about her old home, began to weave together in her mind, forming a tapestry of pure, horrifying clarity. This was never about historical preservation. It was never about his dislike for her design. It was never even about the simple grudge of a powerful family against the daughter of a man they'd ruined. It was about the land, the very specific parcel of land on which the Civic Center was to be built. Her father, he wasn't just a journalist. He was an investigative journalist. What had he been working on right before he died? The official story was that he was caught in a stock market scheme, that he'd used insider information and lost everything, taking his own life in a fit of shame and despair. But her father had never cared about money. He cared about stories. He cared about the truth. "Marcus," Alara said, her voice trembling slightly, "my father's old research, his notes, his files. My mother saved everything. It's in storage." That night, Alara drove to a climate-controlled storage unit on the outskirts of the city. Inside, under a dusty canvas tarp, were 24 sealed banker's boxes, a meticulously preserved archive of her father's life's work. For 20 years, she had been unable to bring herself to open them. The pain was too great. Tonight, she had no choice. With a utility knife, she sliced through the tape on the first box. The scent of old paper and ink filled the small, sterile room. Inside were files, neatly labeled. She saw the names of corrupt politicians, mob bosses, corporate raiders, all the dragons her father had tried to slay with his pen. She worked through the night, fueled by coffee and a growing sense of dread. In the 17th box, she found it. A thin manila folder labeled simply North Riverfront. Inside were maps of the area from the 1970s, geological surveys, and city planning documents. And there were pages of handwritten notes. Her father had been investigating a story, a huge one, decades ago. Several chemical companies had operated along the riverfront. They had illegally dumped tons of toxic waste into the ground, a fact that had been covered up with the help of city officials. Her father had found evidence that the contamination was far worse than anyone knew, and that it was slowly leaching towards the city's water table. But the most damning document was at the bottom of the folder. It was a copy of a signed affidavit from a low-level city inspector, dated the week before her father died. The inspector confessed to falsifying environmental reports for years, and he named the person who paid him to do it a young, ambitious real estate developer who was secretly buying up the contaminated land for pennies on the dollar. A man named Alexander Thorne. Alara dropped the file. The air left her lungs. It all clicked into place. Her father was about to expose Alexander Thorne for a catastrophic environmental crime. To save himself, Alexander had to silence him. But killing a famous journalist was too risky. So, he discredited him. He and his allies fabricated the financial scandal, framing her father so completely that no one would ever believe his reporting again. They destroyed his reputation, drove him to despair. And then, after his death, Alexander Thorne, the man responsible, had swept in to play the role of the benevolent savior, buying their house through a shell company to complete the illusion of charity. And Julian Thorne, a teenager at the time, had to have known. He was a participant, a keeper of the family's darkest secret. His entire life, his political career, his family's sterling reputation, it was all built on the ruins of her family, on a foundation of lies and toxic soil. His lifelong campaign against her was not about a grudge. It was about fear. Fear that she, her father's daughter, might one day uncover the truth. And now, by a stroke of cosmic irony, her greatest architectural achievement was slated to be built on the very piece of land that held his family's original sin. The excavation for the Civic Center's foundation would have unearthed the evidence of the dumping, exposing the crime her father had died trying to reveal. The fight was no longer professional. It had become primal. This was not about a building anymore. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming her father's name from the mud where the thorns had buried it. A cold, righteous fury settled into her soul. Julian Thorne wasn't just her rival. He was the living embodiment of the lie that had destroyed her life. And she was going to tear him down, stone by stone. Julian Thorne sensed the shift in the battle. Alara's defense had become too precise. Her questions at the public hearings too pointed. She was no longer just fighting for her building. She was probing, searching. He realized with a jolt of ice-cold panic that she must be investigating his past, his family's past. The carefully buried secret he had protected his entire life was under threat. He had to end it. Now. His counterattack was swift, brutal, and aimed at the heart of everything Alara had built. He called in his oldest and most powerful favors, leveraging decades of accumulated political capital to launch a devastating two-pronged assault. The first blow landed on Alara's firm. Using his influence with the Department of Buildings, he triggered a snap safety audit on the Viridian Tower, a 40-story residential skyscraper that was Alara's most recently completed project. It was her masterpiece, the building that had established her reputation. The audit, conducted by an inspector on Thorne's payroll, was a sham. They discovered a supposed structural flaw in the building's foundation, a fabrication based on a deliberate misreading of the architectural plans. The news broke like a thunderclap. The Department of Buildings issued an immediate, high-profile stop work order on the final interior finishes and, more devastatingly, refused to issue the certificate of occupancy. Hundreds of new tenants were barred from moving in. Lawsuits from the developer and the tenants were filed against Vance Architecture within hours. The firm's insurance premiums skyrocketed overnight. Their line of credit was frozen. Ilara was facing financial ruin. Her reputation as a meticulous, safety-conscious architect was being systematically dismantled in the press. The second blow was aimed at Marcus. Thorne, using his connections in the district attorney's office, moved against him directly. One morning, as Marcus arrived at work, he was met by two detectives from the DA's Public Integrity Unit. They presented him with a warrant and arrested him in the lobby of the City Records Building, in full view of his colleagues. The charge was felony theft of classified city documents. The evidence was a set of sensitive environmental reports, the same ones her father had been using, that had been planted in Marcus's car. It was a crude, vicious frame-up, designed to neutralize him as a threat and send a chilling message to Ilara. She received the call from a frantic Liam while she was in an emergency meeting with her lawyers. "They arrested Marcus," Liam said, his voice cracking. "They perp-walked him out of his office. Ilara, they're saying he could face 10 years in prison." Ilara felt the floor drop out from under her. Thorne had crossed a line she hadn't thought possible. He had put an innocent man, her father's loyal friend, in a cage. The weight of it was crushing. This was her fault. She had asked Marcus to help her, and she had led him into a trap. She was now at her lowest point. Her firm was on the verge of bankruptcy. Her greatest professional achievement was being publicly declared a death trap. Her dearest friend was facing a prison sentence for a crime he didn't commit. The Civic Center project was all but dead, buried under an avalanche of scandal and bad press. Thorne had checkmated her. He had attacked her on all fronts, leaving her with no resources, no allies, and no way out. That night, she sat alone in her darkened office, the city a glittering, indifferent expanse below. The silence was absolute. Her phones had finally stopped ringing. Her lawyers had advised her to declare bankruptcy. The developer of the Viridian Tower was threatening to sue her into oblivion. The weight of despair was a physical presence, pressing down on her, suffocating her. She thought about giving up. She could issue a public apology, withdraw her bid for the Civic Center, and beg Thorne to have the charges against Marcus dropped. She could sacrifice her career to save her friend. It was the only rational move left. To continue fighting would be to risk not only her own future, but Marcus's freedom. She pulled up a photo on her computer. It was an old, faded picture of her and her father, taken on the steps of their old house. She was a little girl, sitting on his shoulders, laughing. He was looking up at her, his face filled with an adoration and pride that transcended the years. He had fought for the truth, and it had cost him everything. If she gave up now, his sacrifice would mean nothing. The Thornes would have won completely, their lies cementing into the permanent, official history of the city. A new feeling began to displace the despair. It was not hope. It was something harder, something colder. It was the grim resolve of a person with nothing left to lose. Thorne thought he had taken everything from her. He was wrong. He had taken away her business, her reputation, and her peace of mind. But in doing so, he had given her a gift. He had given her clarity. He had stripped away everything but the core of the fight, the single, burning purpose that now defined her existence to expose the truth, no matter the cost. She picked up her phone. There was one last move she could make, one final, desperate gambit. It would mean risking everything, putting herself in the full glare of the public spotlight with no safety net. But it was the only path left. She called the clerk of the city council. "This is Ilara Vance," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. Please inform the council president that I will be exercising my right to address the full council at the public hearing for the final vote on the North Riverfront project. Yes. I am aware of the recommendation to cancel. I will be speaking anyway. She was walking into the lion's den, unarmed and surrounded. Thorn would be there, sitting on his throne, ready to deliver the final, killing blow. He thought he had already won. He had no idea that a cornered animal is the most dangerous one of all. The city council chamber was a theater of power, all dark wood, faded gold leaf, and solemn portraits of forgotten patriarchs. The air was heavy with the weight of a century of backroom deals and broken promises. On this rainy Tuesday afternoon, it was packed to capacity. Journalists lined the walls, their cameras poised. The gallery was filled with a tense mix of Alara's supporters and Thorn's political allies. It was standing room only. The hearing was being broadcast live on the city's public access channel, a fact that was central to Alara's strategy. This was Thorn's home turf, a place where he commanded absolute authority. He sat at the center of the raised dais, a portrait of civic virtue, his expression one of somber reluctance. He had spent the last 2 months orchestrating this moment, the public execution of Alara's dream. Alara sat alone at the petitioner's table, a single microphone before her. She looked small and isolated in the cavernous room, the weight of her firm's collapse and Marcus's imprisonment clinging to her like a shroud. To the outside world, she looked defeated. The council president, a longtime ally of Thorn's, called the hearing to order. We are here today for a final vote on the North Riverfront Civic Center project. Given the recent, unfortunate events surrounding the lead architect's firm and the unanimous recommendation of the Community Impact Review Board, the council is expected to vote to terminate the contract. However, Ms. Vance has exercised her right to address the chamber. Ms. Vance, you have 10 minutes. Alara walked to the podium. A sudden downpour lashed against the tall, arched windows, the drumming of the rain a percussive score to the unfolding drama. She took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the faces on the council, settling finally on Julian Thorn. He gave her a small, pitying smile. It was the smile of a victor. Thank you, Mr. President. Members of the council, Alara began, her voice clear and steady, amplified by the microphone throughout the silent chamber. I am not here today to talk about architecture. I am not here to defend my design or to plead for my project. I am here to talk about a crime that has remained buried under the soil of the North Riverfront for more than 20 years. A confused murmur rippled through the room. Thorn's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. This was not the desperate, emotional plea he had been expecting. Alara continued, her voice gaining strength. For 2 months, this council has been led to believe that the opposition to my project is based on concerns of historical preservation. This is a lie. The true reason for Councilman Thorn's relentless campaign to kill this project is to prevent the excavation of the site, because that excavation would uncover evidence of illegal toxic dumping by chemical companies in the 1970s, a cover-up orchestrated by his father, Alexander Thorn. Gasps erupted from the gallery. The journalists began typing furiously. On the dais, Thorn's face had become a pale, tight mask of fury. Point of order. Mr. President, he boomed, rising to his feet. This is an outrageous and slanderous accusation. This woman is using this chamber to peddle insane conspiracy theories, to deflect from her own professional failings. She has no evidence. On the contrary, Councilman, Alara said, her voice cutting through the uproar. I have a great deal of evidence. She gestured to a large screen behind the council dais. If you would direct your attention to the screen. Liam, positioned at the back of the room with a laptop, brought the first image to life. It was a high-resolution scan of her father's notes, the pages detailing the chemical dumping. These are the research notes of the investigative journalist Robert Vance. My father. He was killed professionally and personally to suppress this story 20 years ago. Thorne laughed. A harsh, dismissive sound. Notes from a disgraced man. This is your proof. This is pathetic. This is my foundation, Ilara countered. Next slide. Please. An image of the Argus Holdings Incorporation papers appeared. This is the shell company, founded by Alexander Thorne, which was used to purchase my family's home the day after my father died. A strange act of charity, wouldn't you say? Thorne's composure began to crack. This is a private family matter. It has no bearing on this hearing. It has every bearing, Ilara shot back, her voice ringing with conviction, because it establishes a pattern of covering up the truth at any cost. She took a step closer to the dais. And now for the final piece of evidence. The piece that ties it all together. She held up a single, scanned document on her tablet, its image appearing on the large screen. It was the sworn affidavit from the city inspector, confessing to falsifying environmental reports and naming Alexander Thorne as the man who paid him. And then she saw it. The signature at the bottom of the page. The notary stamp that made the document legally binding. It was a signature she knew as well as her own. Arthur Pendleton. Her mentor, the esteemed, silver-haired architect who had given Ilara her first internship when no one else would touch the daughter of a disgraced man. The man who had encouraged her, guided her, and who had written a glowing recommendation for her civic center proposal. He was sitting in the front row of the gallery, his face beaming with pride. In that heart-stopping moment, she realized the true, devastating nature of the Thornes' cunning. They hadn't just silenced their enemies. They had used good, unsuspecting people as pawns in their game. Arthur, a young, ambitious city planner back then, had likely been asked to notarize a stack of documents by the powerful Alexander Thorne. A simple, bureaucratic sign-off, never knowing the poison contained in the pages he was stamping. The secondary twist landed like a physical blow. Releasing this evidence would destroy Thorne. But it would also implicate Arthur. It would ruin the life and reputation of an innocent man she deeply respected. The room seemed to recede, the faces blurring. All she could see was Arthur's kind, trusting face. Was her revenge worth this collateral damage? Thorne, seeing her hesitation, seized the opportunity. "What's the matter, Ms. Vance? Looking for another ghost in your machine. There's nothing there." His arrogance was the spark that ignited her resolve. She would not sacrifice an innocent man, but she would not let Thorne win. She had to find another way, a better way. She looked away from the signature, focusing the council's attention on the text of the affidavit itself. "This document," she said, her voice regaining its power, "is a confession. It details how Alexander Thorne systematically bribed city officials to hide a massive public health risk. But what is most tragic about it is how he manipulated good people to achieve his ends. He used his power and influence to coerce and deceive junior city employees, people who built their careers on public trust, people who were used as unwitting instruments in his crime." She looked directly at Arthur Pendleton in the audience, her gaze filled with a quiet, profound apology and a promise. He preyed on the ambitious and the honorable alike. He turned public servants into his private tools. She then pivoted, her eyes locking with Thorne's. "And you, councilman, learned from the master. You tried to do the same to Marcus Thorne, a dedicated public servant, framing him to hide your family's crimes. You did the same to the building inspector who signed a false report on my Viridian Tower. Your father poisoned the ground, and you have spent your life poisoning the people and institutions of this city to protect that original sin." It was a masterstroke. She had exposed the core of the crime while framing Arthur not as a conspirator, but as a victim, another example of the Thorns' manipulative tactics. She had weaponized the truth with surgical precision. The chamber erupted into chaos. Council members were shouting. The press was in a frenzy. Thorn, his face ashen, his mask of civility finally shattered, pointed a shaking finger at her. Lies, all of it, lies. But it was too late. The evidence was on the screen. The narrative was undeniable. Alara had not just defended her project. She had rewritten the history of the last 20 years in front of a live television audience. She had outmaneuvered him in his own arena, using his own procedural rules against him. The ghosts of the past were no longer whispering in the halls of City Hall. They were screaming from the rafters. And, for the first time, everyone was listening. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of controlled demolition. As the public hearing descended into chaos, the council president had no choice but to call a recess. Julian Thorn, surrounded by a frantic bubble of aides, was escorted out a back door. His face a thunderous mask of disbelief. He had walked into the chamber a king and left a fugitive from a history he could no longer control. The media firestorm was instantaneous and all-consuming. The live feed of Alara's testimony went viral, replayed on every news channel. The name Thorn, once synonymous with power and prestige, was now irrevocably linked to corruption, conspiracy, and a massive environmental cover-up. The district attorney, facing immense public pressure and the undeniable evidence Alara had presented, announced a full-scale criminal investigation into Julian Thorn and the historical business dealings of his late father. Within 24 hours, the first dominoes fell. The city building inspector who had falsified the Viridian Tower report confessed, admitting he had been blackmailed by Thorn. The charges against Marcus Thorn were dropped, and he was released from custody, emerging from the city jail into a crowd of reporters, a quiet man blinking in the sudden, harsh glare of vindication. The city council, in a desperate act of political self-preservation, reconvened the following day. In a session that lasted less than 5 minutes, they voted unanimously not only to reinstate Alara's contract for the Civic Center, but to issue a formal apology and offer her firm a financial settlement to cover the damages incurred by Thorn's sabotage. It was a stunning, complete reversal. Amidst the public storm, Alara sought a moment of quiet resolution. She found Arthur Pendleton in his office, a grand, book-lined room that now felt like a cage. The old architect looked broken, his face etched with a shame so profound it was painful to witness. "I had no idea." "Alara," he whispered, his hands trembling as he stared at a copy of the affidavit on his desk. "He was Alexander Thorn. He came to my desk with a stack of papers. Said the mayor needed them notarized by the end of the day. I was young. I was ambitious. I didn't even read them. I just stamped and signed. For 20 years. I've had no idea what I did. What I helped him do to your father. To you." Alara sat opposite him, not with accusation, but with a deep, weary empathy. "He used you, Arthur, just like he used me, just like his son tried to use Marcus and countless others. That's what they do. They turn good people into instruments for their own greed. The guilt you feel belongs to them, not you." Tears welled in the old man's eyes. "But your speech. You protected me. In front of the world. You painted me as a victim, not an accomplice. Why?" "Because it was the truth." Alara said simply, And because revenge isn't about destroying everyone in the blast radius, it's about hitting the right target. You were never my target. She reached across the desk and placed her hand over his. He used us both. Arthur. Now, we get to build something better. Together. The conversation was a quiet turning point. It was the moment Alara's quest for justice purified itself of the last vestiges of pure revenge. She had chosen compassion over scorched earth, healing over wholesale destruction. A week later, Julian Thorne was arrested at his ancestral estate. The television cameras captured the image of the once untouchable councilman being led away in handcuffs, his face gaunt and defeated. The empire the Thornes had built over generations had crumbled to dust in less than a month. Alara watched the news report on her phone. Standing on the deserted, rain-slicked grounds of the North Riverfront, the air smelled of wet earth and the river. The land was silent, waiting. Her battle was over. The falling action was complete. Now, the work of building could begin. 6 months later, the North Riverfront was transformed. The silence was gone, replaced by the symphony of construction, the roar of bulldozers, the rhythmic clang of steel on steel, the shouts of workers. Where there had once been cracked concrete and weeds, there was now a vast, clean slate, the graded earth awaiting the foundations of a future she had fought for and won. The groundbreaking ceremony was held on a crisp, brilliant autumn morning. The sky was an impossible blue, a stark contrast to the gray, rainy day of the public hearing. A stage had been erected at the edge of the construction site, and the crowd was even larger than the one that had filled the council chamber. It was a mix of city officials, investors, union workers, and ordinary citizens who had been captivated by her story. Alara stood at the podium, no longer an isolated petitioner, but a celebrated visionary. The mayor stood beside her, his praise now effusive and genuine. Arthur Pendleton sat in the front row, his face filled with a quiet, restored dignity. Marcus was there, smiling, looking more at peace than he had in years. Liam stood with the rest of her team, their faces beaming with pride. When Alara stepped up to the microphone, a respectful hush fell over the crowd. They expected a speech about architecture, about the building's innovative design and sustainable features. She gave them something else entirely. We are standing today on a piece of land that has a long and complicated history, she began, her voice calm and resonant. For years, it was a place of industry. Then, it became a place of neglect, and it was almost a place where a terrible secret remained buried forever. But today, we consecrate this ground to a new purpose. We are here to build a new civic center, a place for the people of this city. But we are also here to build a monument to the truth. She paused, letting the words settle. The centerpiece of this project will not be an office or a chamber. It will be a library, a free public resource dedicated to the open access of information. And its name will be the Robert Vance Center for Journalistic Integrity and Public Advocacy. A wave of stunned, appreciative applause swept through the crowd. She had done it. She had transformed the site of her family's destruction into a permanent monument to her father's stolen legacy. She had used her restored power not just to build a structure, but to rectify a history. This was the ultimate victory, a final, symbolic act of rebirth. After the ceremony, as she mingled with well-wishers, a young assistant from the mayor's office approached her, holding a small, worn manila envelope. Ms. Vance, this was just delivered by a courier. There's no return address. Alara took the envelope, a flicker of curiosity cutting through the joyful noise of the celebration. She stepped away from the crowd, Seeking a moment of privacy near the edge of the construction pit, she opened the unsealed flap. Inside, there was no note, no letter. There was only a single object. It was an old press badge. Its plastic yellowed with age. The photo faded. The name printed beneath the picture was Robert Vance, Gotham Chronicle. It was her father's, the one he had been wearing the day his world fell apart. The one that had been missing from the box of his personal effects, returned to her mother all those years ago. She turned it over in her hand. It was a ghost, a relic from a lost world. She didn't know who had sent it. Perhaps it was an old colleague of her father's from the paper. Perhaps it was a clerk from the police evidence room who had kept it safe all these years. Or perhaps it was someone new, a secret admirer within the system who had been inspired by her courage, a sign that her actions had started a quiet revolution in the city's forgotten corners. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it was here, back in her hands. It was a final, tangible piece of her past, returned to her on the day she had secured her future. Alara Vance clutched the badge, the worn plastic warm against her palm. She looked up from the relic of the past and out at the vast, open expanse before her, at the promise of the great structure that would soon rise from the earth. A small, genuine smile touched her lips as the autumn sun warmed her face. Her war was over. Her father's work was done. Her own had just begun.